My name is Emily Carter. I'm 26 years old, and the night everything I thought I knew about my family completely fell apart started with the smallest, quietest sound in the room. It wasn't shouting or arguing or a dramatic reveal. It was the soft, polite clink of crystal. That sound marked the beginning of a moment that would permanently change how I saw my parents, my past, and my future. It was my graduation dinner for completing my master's degree in marketing, one of those expensive, over-the-top celebrations my parents loved. The restaurant had white tablecloths, low lighting, hovering waiters, and a bill I knew I could never afford, even if I emptied every account I had. I was sitting there in a dress I had bought using a credit card that was already maxed out, smiling politely while mentally calculating my student loan payment for the next month. Rent, interest, minimum payments, numbers that constantly lived in my head. I was trying to stay present, trying to enjoy the night, when my grandmother stood up and raised her glass. The entire private room went silent, like someone had pressed mute on the world. She smiled at me, calm and proud, and said she was incredibly proud of how responsibly I had handled the $3.6 million she had set aside for me. For a moment, I genuinely believed I had misheard her. $3.6 million made no sense in the context of my life. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, my chest tightened, and my mind struggled to process what she had just said. The only numbers even close to that size in my world were my total student debt and the prices of apartments I could never afford. I stared at her and finally managed to ask what she meant by $3.6 million. She looked confused, almost amused, and explained that it was my fund, the trust she had created when I was born, and that my parents had told her I'd been handling it very responsibly. Around me, I could feel the atmosphere change instantly. Chairs shifted, glasses were set down too hard, and the energy at the table turned sharp and uncomfortable. I didn't even have to look at my parents to feel the panic coming off them. That was the moment the celebration ended in my mind, because I realized there was an entirely different version of my life that I was supposed to be living. A version where money wasn't constant stress. A version no one had ever told me about. The dinner continued after that, at least on the surface. People laughed, toasted, took photos, and asked me about my future plans. I nodded and smiled, but I had no idea what anyone was saying. My parents kept watching me closely, like they were waiting for me to explode in front of everyone. I didn't. I held myself together until the check was paid, the hugs were exchanged, and we stepped outside under the yellow glow of the streetlights. My grandmother hugged me and whispered that we would talk more about my future soon, and that she was very proud of me. I almost told her right then that I had no idea what she was talking about, but my mother's hand landed firmly on my shoulder, and my father quickly said they would handle it. The way he said it made it sound like this was some routine family matter, not a bomb that had just gone off in my life. I told them I was riding with them and that we were talking that night. The car ride was long and painfully quiet. There was no music, no small talk, just the GPS voice and the sound of my father tapping the steering wheel. Eventually, I asked how long they had known about the money. My dad sighed and said they had known since I was born. Hearing that hurt more than the number itself. I found out by accident, in public, while I had been struggling financially for years. When we got to their house, I demanded the truth. No vague answers, no delaying the conversation. They admitted there was a trust and that the amount was around $3.6 million, but then my mother quietly said that not all of it was still there. They explained that they had borrowed from it, invested it for the family, helped my brother's startup, covered expenses, and planned to put it back eventually. The number they admitted to using was $2.75 million. That amount made me feel physically sick. While I had taken out loans, worked multiple jobs, skipped medical appointments, and lived in a tiny apartment just to survive, they had been using money meant for my future as if it were their own. When I confronted them, they defended themselves by saying they had done everything for the family and that I should be grateful for the opportunities one had growing up. My brother admitted he knew a fund existed, but claimed he didn't understand the rules. That night, I left. On the train back to Brooklyn, I opened my phone and typed, "Can parents legally use your trust fund without telling you?" The days that followed felt unreal. I ignored emails, missed deadlines, and barely left my apartment. On the third day, my friend showed up unannounced, took one look at me, and told me I needed to call my grandmother. I was terrified to do it because she believed I had been managing the money responsibly. But when I finally told her everything, she listened without interrupting. She sent me documents she had kept copies of, including the trust agreement and statements. The terms were clear. The money was mine. My parents were guardians, not owners, and I was supposed to take control years earlier. There were no clauses allowing them to use the money for family expenses or my brother's business. That's when we brought in a forensic accountant, and everything became undeniable. The records showed a clear pattern of money being moved out of my trust into LLCs connected to my parents and my brother, disguised as investments and grants. It wasn't confusion or a one-time mistake. It was deliberate. From that point on, things moved quickly. We sent a formal demand letter. They tried to ignore it, then offered small repayments with conditions that I stay quiet. I refused. The case eventually went to court, where the paper trail told the story they couldn't. The judge ruled that they had breached their fiduciary duty and ordered full repayment with interest, removing them as trustees. When the money finally began returning to the trust, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like being able to breathe again. I paid off my loans, cleared my debts, and for the first time in my life, my future felt stable instead of terrifying. That sound of a glass clinking at my graduation dinner no longer feels like the moment everything broke. It feels like the moment the truth finally surfaced, and the point where I stopped living the story I was given and started taking control of my own. The days after I spoke to my grandmother felt strange and disconnected, like I was living someone else's life from the outside. I went back to my apartment in Brooklyn, dropped my bag by the door, and didn't touch it again for 2 days. Emails from work piled up, reminders and follow-ups stacked one on top of another, but none of it felt real anymore. Every time I opened my laptop, my eyes went back to the trust documents my grandmother had sent. My name at the top. Black ink. Official language. Proof that the life I had been living was missing a massive truth. I read the trust agreement over and over until the words burned into my mind. It was clear enough that even I could understand it. The account was created when I was born. My grandmother funded it over time. My parents were listed as guardians, not owners, and their responsibility was to protect the assets until I reached the appropriate age. I was supposed to have full control years ago. There were no exceptions written anywhere for family emergencies, business ventures, or helping my brother chase his dreams. The money was meant for me and only me. When my grandmother called again, her voice sounded different than I had ever heard it before. Calm, but sharp. She told me she had spoken to someone she trusted, a forensic accountant in the city who specialized in tracing money that people did not want found. She asked me if I was willing to meet with her and find out exactly what had happened to the trust. Saying yes felt terrifying, but not knowing felt worse, so I agreed. The accountant's office didn't look dramatic or intimidating. It was quiet and minimal, the kind of place where bad news was delivered politely and thoroughly. I handed over the documents, my grandmother's statements, and the notes I had been keeping. She read everything carefully, occasionally underlining something or making a small mark in the margin. When she finally looked up, she told me the trust terms were not vague and that my parents had a legal duty to protect the funds, not treat them like a family account. What she needed next were full bank records from the last several years. 2 weeks later, I sat in the same office staring at a stack of papers thick enough to make my stomach turn. The accountant had organized everything with color-coded highlights. Blue for normal investment activity. Red for withdrawals tied directly to my parents. Orange for anything connected to my brother. There was far more red and orange than blue. She walked me through the timeline slowly, showing how large amounts of money had started leaving the trust around the time my brother launched his company. The funds were transferred into LLCs tied to my parents, then funneled into a startup, real estate purchases, renovations, and personal expenses. Listening to her explain it felt surreal. The money that had paid for lake house improvements, new cars, and lifestyle upgrades was the same money I had been stretching ramen with and counting pennies against. She explained that this was not a misunderstanding or poor record-keeping. It was a clear pattern of misappropriation, structured carefully enough to look legitimate at a glance. That word stayed with me. Misappropriation. It meant what I had felt all along but hadn't wanted to say out loud. That night, I called my grandmother and told her everything I had learned. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke. Then she told me something that made my chest tighten even more. Years earlier, my father had managed an inheritance issue involving her sister, and there had been questions then too. My grandmother admitted she had chosen not to believe them because she wanted to trust her son. Hearing that made everything feel heavier, like this wasn't just about me, but about a pattern that had gone unchallenged for years. I reached out to an aunt I hadn't seen in a long time, my father's younger sister. When I asked if she had time to talk about family and money, she responded almost immediately. During our call, she told me how she had been promised a modest inheritance from their father, only to be told later that taxes had wiped it out. She had never seen paperwork. Never received proof. She had only a sick feeling that something wasn't right. Hearing her say she believed me felt like both comfort and confirmation. With the evidence we had, the accountant and a lawyer helped us draft a formal demand letter. It laid out the amount taken, the transactions, and the breach of duty. It gave my parents a chance to return the funds or propose a legitimate repayment plan. The tone was calm and professional, but the message was clear. This was no longer a private family disagreement. When the letter was sent, there was silence. Days passed with no response. Then my father emailed me, asking to talk as a family and warning that lawyers would only make things worse. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I agreed to meet in a public place and told my grandmother to come with me. I knew by then that I couldn't face them alone again. The meeting was tense but controlled. They minimized what they had done, justified it, and tried to guilt me into backing down. I laid out the documents, pointed to the numbers, and explained exactly what we knew. When they realized how much evidence existed, their confidence cracked. Still, they didn't agree to make things right. They asked for time. Shortly after that meeting, I posted my story anonymously online. I didn't name names or include identifying details, but I told the truth. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of strangers shared similar experiences, confirmed that what had happened to me was real, and encouraged me to keep going. For the first time, I didn't feel isolated or crazy. I felt supported. When my parents' lawyers finally responded, the offer was insulting. A small repayment stretched over years, no interest, and a requirement that I never speak about it again. I refused. At that point, I understood that staying quiet would only protect the people who had already taken enough from me. We filed the lawsuit. Seeing my name on the court documents felt unreal, but also grounding. Discovery uncovered everything they had tried to hide. Every transaction. Every shell company. Every attempt to disguise personal spending as something else. When the trial came, the truth was laid out piece by piece, and it was impossible to deny. The judge ruled in my favor, ordering full repayment with interest and removing my parents as trustees. When it was over, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted and lighter at the same time, like I had finally put down a burden I had been carrying without realizing it. The money returned gradually as properties were sold and accounts were liquidated. Each payment erased a piece of my old anxiety. Student loans disappeared. Credit cards hit zero. For the first time, my future felt solid instead of fragile. Looking back, I understand now that this was never just about money. It was about control, secrecy, and the assumption that I would never ask questions. The sound of that glass clinking at my graduation dinner didn't end my world. It cracked it open. And through that crack, I finally saw the truth clearly enough to choose what I would do next. Once the lawsuit was officially filed, there was no going back. Everything that had been whispered in kitchens and hidden behind family smiles was now written into court documents with dates, amounts, and signatures. The discovery process was thorough and unforgiving. Bank statements, tax filings, internal emails, corporate records tied to my brother's company, and even credit card charges were pulled into evidence. Each document confirmed the same thing: the money taken from my trust had not been accidental, temporary, or misunderstood. It had been used deliberately to support a lifestyle and a business that were never authorized. Sitting in the courtroom for the first time felt surreal. The space was quiet and formal, nothing like the emotional chaos that had led me there. My parents sat across from me, dressed carefully, their expressions controlled, as if this were just another professional obligation. My brother sat behind them, avoiding my eyes. When I testified, I spoke calmly, answering questions and explaining how I had learned about the trust, how I had lived under financial pressure for years, and how I had discovered the truth through documents rather than honesty. Hearing my own story read back into the record made it feel real in a way nothing else had. My grandmother testified next. Her voice never shook. She explained why she had created the trust, how it was intended for me alone, and how she had trusted my parents to protect it. When she was asked whether she had ever approved the money being used for my brother's company or for family expenses, she answered clearly that she had not. The forensic accountant followed, walking the court through the money trail step by step. The flow of funds was impossible to ignore. Withdrawals aligned perfectly with property purchases, renovations, and business expenses that benefited everyone except the person the trust was created for. My parents' defense focused on intent. They argued that they never meant to harm me and that their decisions were made under financial pressure and for the good of the family. They suggested that because I had grown up in a comfortable home and attended good schools, the trust had indirectly benefited me. The judge listened, asked questions, and reviewed the evidence without emotion. When the ruling was delivered, it was clear and decisive. The court found that my parents had breached their fiduciary duty, misappropriated trust assets, and attempted to conceal their actions. They were ordered to repay the full amount taken, along with interest, and were removed as trustees effective immediately. Walking out of the courthouse that day did not feel like a victory lap. It felt quiet and heavy, like the end of a long storm. The money did not return all at once. Properties were sold, accounts were liquidated, and payments were made in stages under the supervision of a professional trustee. Each transfer brought relief, not excitement. I paid off my student loans, closed credit card balances, and cleared lingering medical bills. For the first time in years, my financial decisions were about planning instead of survival. I did not celebrate my parents' losses, but I also did not step in to soften the consequences. They moved into a smaller home, adjusted to a very different lifestyle, and faced the reality of their choices. My brother's business did not recover, and he eventually took a job unrelated to the startup world he had once been convinced would save us all. I did not interfere in any of it. Their lives moved forward separately from mine, and that distance felt necessary. In the months that followed, I began to talk openly about what had happened. What started as anonymous posts became conversations, and those conversations turned into something more structured. I realized how many people had experienced financial betrayal within their own families and had never spoken about it out of fear or shame. Sharing my story did not erase what I went through, but it gave it meaning beyond my own life. My grandmother passed away the following spring, quietly and peacefully. In her final note to me, she wrote that she was proud not because I had won, but because I had refused to stay silent. She left me a portion of her estate, and I used part of it to create a small fund in her name that helps young adults afford initial consultations with forensic accountants and attorneys when something feels wrong with their family finances. It is not a large foundation, but it exists, and that matters. People sometimes ask whether I forgive my parents. I do not have a simple answer. I no longer feel consumed by anger, but I also do not pretend that trust can be rebuilt just because time has passed. I have learned that forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation, and that boundaries are sometimes the healthiest outcome. What I do know is that I no longer carry their choices as my burden. Looking back, I understand now that the sound of that glass clinking at my graduation dinner was not the moment my life fell apart. It was the moment the story I had been given cracked open. It forced the truth into the open and gave me the chance to take control of my future with clear eyes. Power without accountability thrives in silence, especially when it hides behind the word family. Asking questions does not make you ungrateful, and demanding transparency does not make you disloyal. My world did not end that night. It changed. And in that change, I finally stopped living someone else's version of my life and started building my own, one honest decision at a time.